The Home Secretary has promised British business that the door will not be closed on European workers after Brexit, at the same time as the government insists it's sticking to its net migration target of tens of thousands. So as calls for an interim agreement with the EU gather pace in some quarters, we're asking whether the European Union principle of freedom of movement of people and labour is negotiable. Joining me are Lucy Thomas, the former Deputy Director of the Remain campaign, Britain Stronger in Europe, now head of Brexit advice at the PR firm Edelman, and Dr Gerard Lyons, co-chair of the Economists for Free Trade, previously known as Economists for Brexit. He's a former chief economic advisor to Boris Johnson as Mayor of London. Welcome to you both. In your view, to what extent was limiting and cutting European Union immigration into this country part of what the vote for Brexit was about?
Obviously, people voted for all sorts of reasons, but lots of the data at the time and since suggests that three factors dominated the voting: sovereignty, namely democracy, migration, and then the economy. So in answer to your question, migration clearly was a key factor. And it wasn't against having any migration. It was basically, it seemed that people wanted a sensible migration policy. So in that context, anything that adds to making the correct decision is welcome news.
Do you accept that? That's what it was about?
I certainly think for some people, I spent quite a lot of time during the campaign going around the country listening to people, and there was certainly a sense that how can it be right you have free movement of people from the EU but you can control immigration from the rest of the world. So I definitely accept that. I think, you know, there was obviously never a defined figure from the Leave campaign. We didn't have a bus with a specific number of migrants that the Leave campaign wanted to see it reduced to. So I think it's very welcome that now this is a pragmatic step from the government to look at, OK, what works practically for businesses.
I mean, do you see the Home Secretary actually, do you see this as a softening of the government's position?
I think actually gathering evidence isn't a sign of softening. I think it's better late than never. I think it could have happened a year ago because we'll only have the findings in September 2018, where there's a limited amount of time to feed into the discussions. But I think it's absolutely right to have that core evidence base, see what the public sector, what healthcare needs, what businesses need, and then work out a system which actually works in practice.
What about the economic impacts of EU migration in this country? I mean, how would you assess them? We were speaking earlier on, someone saying, well, look, we put in much more than we take out, and there seem to be studies that suggest that's true.
OK, I'm surprised actually it's going to take a year because there is so much data available. When I was at City Hall, I chaired the Strategic Migration Partnership and championed the living wage.
And of course, Boris Johnson was very much in favour of
and there is so much data.
Open migration.
Well, we need to have sensible migration. One of the things that didn't come out in the campaign, but the Centre for Social Justice highlighted it, was the big difference between migrants from the so-called EU 15 countries and migrants from the A8 countries. Migrants from the EU 15 countries, Western Europe, paid on average higher taxes than the UK taxpayer. So they worked largely in London or skilled jobs. Migrants from the A8, Eastern Europe, paid significantly less tax, were topped up by benefits, and they basically were working either in the regions or low-skill jobs. And Professor Bob Rothorn at Cambridge University, for a Civitas paper 18 months ago, showed how large-scale migration, particularly across the country, was suppressing wages, adding to pressure on housing and public services. So I think all of this comes into the debate. It's not that people are anti-migrants. They want to have a sensible policy, and it links in.
But on balance, in terms of contribution to the GDP...
No, well, actually, it does depend, because if you take into account migrants...
But you can aggregate them.
It is. Basically, people tend to pick the data they tend to feel. But what you find is that if you look at over a whole lifetime, when the whole family of people come in, then that adds to tremendous pressure. And what Rothorn's paper, Professor Rothorn's paper, showed that you could actually meet the economic needs with a very low number of migrants, as we used to in the past.
I simply don't agree with that. I've heard businesses over several years almost tearing their hair out that today they can't find the skills and the labour that they need. If you look at, since Brexit, in the food production sector, they've had the lowest level of migration for 12 years. And that's a real problem for them.
What they're saying, and I agree with you, what they are saying is right. But the other thing that hasn't come out in the debate, and hopefully will in the next year, is if you look over last 20 years, UK firms, particularly big ones, have underinvested in UK skills and training. They don't actually invest in their staff. And that's why, when you actually ask the firms, they often say what you say. For instance, construction sector is another sector. So there is no doubt, in economic terms, migration can be good news for the economy. But what we actually need to do is control the scale of migration, because it has impacts on public services. And we actually need to address the underlying issue, which the GMB trade union has also highlighted, the fact that UK firms need to invest more in skills and training.
So what about that suggestion that it may work for business, that they can get the talent they want, they can perhaps pay workers a bit less, but if you look at the overall costs on our society, it is a negative?
Well, I think we're almost at full employment, so the question has to be, if you want to keep on growing, where do you get that labour from? Because if it doesn't exist here, these companies do invest in skills, they do try and...
Real wages have been going down for a long time, which suggests that actually it may be people being prepared to make sacrifices to keep others in jobs.
Well, I think if you start restricting that, you will see prices going up. And I think we've already got inflation, we've already got the cost of living going up
as well there.
Absolutely.
And you might see an increase in skills.
But in terms of inflation...
Perhaps, but I think you have to be able to balance it, and there has to absolutely be a tapering, because today all of these companies are saying we simply do not have the skills to fill the jobs. I think if you look at the nursing and healthcare, for example, which would be majorly affected by any restriction, already 96% fewer EU migrants are applying to become nurses here, and I think those real-life implications will be very severe.
Look, the economy faces some challenges. The reality is many of the challenges it faces are not linked to Brexit, whether it's the budget deficit, the current account deficit, or the lack of investment in skills and training, and the short-termism of many British firms.
Well, there might be. What about the NHS, though? I mean, because the point is consistently made that a lot of workers in the NHS, nurses, doctors and others, are people from the European Union.
Absolutely. That's why migration is good news if we actually let in the migrants.
But do you think it is good news for the NHS?
Well, in terms of the NHS, the other issue that needs to be addressed is linked to public sector pay across the regions, and the other issue that's been raised by experts in the NHS is the whole way in which nurses are trained. We've now gone to a 3-year university graduate.
All right,
so there are a lot, but
so net.
Yeah, well, no, that's obviously it's positive, and therefore it's not the only change that needs to be made. The whole debate here is not that migration is bad. The whole debate is that we need to have a sensible level of migration. We need to let in the number of people the economy needs and can afford, not just everyone who wants to be here.
And this is an opportunity given to us by Brexit, isn't it?
Well, if you believe in creative destruction, if you believe in ripping everything up in order to have these discussions, like we're seeing with farming, is it right to suddenly stop all subsidies and then decide who you want to give subsidies to? Likewise, do you stop all nurses coming from the EU in order to train people up? I would argue that's a cliff edge. That's massively destructive, and it harms jobs. You need the jobs in the first place in order to fill them with labour.
It's not a cliff edge. Look, the analogy is a bridge. You need to actually know how long you're going to be on that bridge and where you intend to get off. And that's what we need to have. We need to have a sensible policy here. And if one looks at the whole migration debate, it gives us Brexit gives us a lot more opportunities, as you touched on.
We're going to have to end it there. Thank you both very much indeed.